Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third talk for the Neuroscience Lecture Series. As Public Relations Head and Director of the Committee on Undergraduate Enrichment, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to Dr. Nima Bassiri's talk. So I want to address particular thanks to Dr. Nima Bassiri for accepting our offer, and to my great Neuro, Q, and current and rising exec team for their cooperation and initiative in this project. For those of you who are not really familiar with neuro talks, the talk will last 35 to 45 minutes, followed by a 10 to 15 minute question and answers, and then there will be a catered dinner, a Thai catered dinner outside in the lobby, where you'll be able to ask any further questions you might have, learn more about neuro, and mingle with anyone that's attending. So first and foremost, before listing Nima Bassiri's many accomplishments and titles, I just want to stress that he's one of our own, having studied at the University of Chicago in his undergraduate years. He studied psychology and art history here, and then went on to get a Ph.D. in Rhetoric at the University of California-Berkeley. Presently, Nima Bassiri is an ACLS New Faculty Fellow at Duke University. He teaches a class on the history and philosophy of brain and behavioral sciences, in the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, the Department of Philosophy, and the program in literature. And he is a postdoctoral associate of Duke Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Science and Cultural Theory. Tonight, in his talk entitled Pathology and Personhood in the History of Brain Research, Dr. Bassiri discusses a recent consideration among sociologists and anthropologists of science of what the proliferation of neuroscience has meant for categories of person and self today. In his talk, Nima Bassiri offers a historical analysis of the emergence of the category of neural self. He suggests that this category arises as a possibility in relation to transformations in the definitions of normality and pathology in the history of brain research. This spanning from the 17th to 19th century. The talk concludes with an examination of medico-legal discussions on madness, personhood, and the brain in late 19th century British neurology. Please welcome me in welcoming Dr. Nima Bassiri.
Thanks, Jeanne, and thanks to the Neuro Club for inviting me here. I have to say, I took a lot of classes in this room, actually, as an undergrad, and it seemed a lot bigger at the time. It seems like it's shrunk, or maybe I was very small. So, I don't know. So it's customary in my discipline in history of science and history of philosophy science to read a paper, and I'll try and read it as animatedly as I can to make it seem like I'm just coming up with everything on the spot. So hopefully you'll bear with me here. And as I was sort of taking you through a kind of a tour of the history and philosophy of neuroscience with a specific emphasis on this relationship between pathology and personhood, before I sort of draw you very, 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 very far back into the 17th century, I wanted to start in the contemporary, just to sort of have for you sort of situated where I'm sort of coming from. Many of you are neuroscience or bioscience majors, so sort of coming at it from a slightly different disciplinary standpoint, I want to just clarify kind of what that is before I then torture you with 400-year-old texts and these sorts of things. Okay, so this medical anthropologist here, Joseph Dumet, in this very, very interesting volume called The Neuroscientific Term, just last year actually is when it came out, it's a very recent text. He used this term Neuro Helix to describe the recent and highly intertwined set of cross-disciplinary discussions and debates and sort of disputes that have arisen throughout my field, the humanities and the qualitative social sciences, around how it is that we might sort of consider the question of the brain today, and in what senses we should either value or, let's say, challenge the proliferation of these very new neuroscientifically informed explanatory paradigms and frameworks. And I think examples of such sort of paradigms and frameworks you've no doubt come across. They seem familiar enough, these terms like neuroeconomics, neuroaesthetics, neuroethics. There are even newer formations like neurohistory, neuroart history, neuroanthropology, neuromarketing. The list goes on, and I think the list will continue to go on and on. I think there's something very, very interesting about that. Now the question that enlivens much of these recent debates and disputes, especially for us humanists and social scientists, is to what extent we can or should consider ourselves, our experiences, and our possibilities as being descriptively accounted for by claims that are drawn out of the neurosciences. Are we indeed our brains, and if so, into what sort of people does this transform us? Drawing on a kind of recent sort of dispute, or I guess a kind of discussion in science studies, a set of questions has arisen. So for example, should we, as the historian Fernando Vidal asked in this 2009 article titled Brainhood, Anthropological Figure of Modernity, he asks, should we consider our brains as something with which our personhood is being entirely conflated? So we're no longer thinking of ourselves in terms of personhood, but rather in terms of brainhood. Is this a way we should be thinking about ourselves? Or rather, on this other sort of side here, as the sociologist of medicine, Nicholas Rose, has very recently wondered, this is a book that came out about 2 months ago, it's co-authored with this historian Joël Ami-Rached, and it's titled, as you can see, Neuro, is the title, The New Brain Sciences and the Management of the Mind. He asks, should we instead consider the brain as something according to which or through which selfhood might be thought of as something that's modifiable, augmentable, or manageable? And in many respects, the kind of animating question that has arisen in these kind of disputes and in the humanities more broadly can be summed up as, how should we speak about ourselves now that our self is unavoidably forced to work its way through a neural detour? What should we do as a kind of response to this, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences? Now, many of these scholars, in particular Rose and Vidal and many others, have suggested that the feasibility, or if you like, the kind of viability of reimagining the self of the brain doesn't really become a possibility until around the middle of the 20th century. And it's in the year 1962 when the MIT biophysicist Francis Schmidt coins the term neuroscience as an actual cross-disciplinary kind of merging of different kinds of biomedical research around the brain. It's often argued that it's at this moment that heralds the emergence of an entire apparatus of research, investment, and epistemological transformation. And that within this set of developments, the experimental, the cultural, and in some ways, even the kind of, let's say, philosophical or ontological possibilities arise of uncontroversially fulfilling certain descriptive demands of the self through neuroscientific claims. This is the kind of argument that's been sort of circulating. Now, what I want to try and do in the next sort of 45 minutes is to sort of consider the relationship between brain and self from a slightly different historical and, to some extent, historical and philosophical vantage points, as I work as a historian and philosopher of science. And it's one that sort of removes us from the urgency of a lot of these present discussions. And I think also removes us from, I think, the incitement that a lot of us feel, not merely to analyze what's going on around us, but to appraise or to evaluate its potential kind of pitfalls or its values, to say that, oh, these things that are going on in neurosciences are good or bad. And I try not to take a sort of position on this, and I sort of want to offer a slightly different kind of more, let's say, sort of quasi-neutral historical reassessment of this question, the relationship between brain and self. So for that reason, I want to direct my analysis to a span of 200 years. This is the kind of period of time I want to cover today, very quickly. And I'm going to end only in the late 19th century, so I hope you'll bear with me in this sort of historical excursion. And I want to ask this one specific question, which is, how was it possible during the course of these 2 centuries that the brain, and that specifically a kind of neurological discourse, was eventually able to articulate a certain truth about the self? To give you a sense of what I mean, I want to start in the year 1694, which is a bit of a long time ago, but it's also a very important year because it is the year of the publication of the 2nd edition of this book, John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. And it's the 2nd edition that first includes this very famous chapter on personal identity. In this chapter, Locke describes self-identity or personal identity, the identity of feeling oneself as a single person. He grounds this on the continuity of consciousness and consciousness alone. And he says that the limits of consciousness are defined by how far one's consciousness of thoughts and perceptions and memories can extend. And just as a kind of, when I sort of teach this, just philosophically, the reason this is important is this lent to Locke's notion of self a kind of structure of accountability. Insofar as that, in terms of the continuity of our own experiences, so far as our experiences feel continuous with themselves, we're ultimately answerable, at the very least, to ourselves. And it's only in this answerability to ourselves that we can become eventually sort of, there can be a public answerability, or kind of what he calls a forensic accountability. That's the sort of value, the sort of introduction or the contribution of personal identity. Anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail about that chapter, but there's this one line that he has that's very, very interesting. He says, if it be possible for the same man to have distinct, incommunicable consciousnesses at different times, it's passed out that the same man would at different times make different persons, which we see in the sense of mankind, the solemnest declarations of their opinions, human laws not punishing the madman for the sober man's actions, nor the sober man for what the madman did, thereby making them two persons. Now, to be very clear, Locke is not endorsing this idea that in madness we see the emergence of a second person. He writes just below, it's very hard to conceive that Socrates, the same individual man, could be two persons. As far as Locke is concerned, there's no true rationale that could justify the authentic possibility of there being two people in one human being. And in the case of madness, the fact that we speak as if the madman had become another person is merely a kind of figurative way of talking, and not an actual epistemological claim about the person or personal identity. For Locke, as he writes up at the top there, it is precisely not possible for the same man to have distinct, incommunicable consciousness at different times. You can't have two different kind of unrelated consciousnesses. Just for him, it doesn't make sense. And to believe that it would make sense, to believe in that possibility, would be, for Locke, a kind of philosophical absurdity. And it's an absurdity that's predicated on doing this really problematic thing for Locke, which is grounding personal identity not on consciousness, but on a soul, and specifically on a Cartesian soul. The idea for Descartes was that your soul is always thinking. That is the nature of its existence, to constantly think, I think, therefore I am. And so it's always thinking, even if you're not cognizant that it's thinking. And if it's thinking and you're not cognizant, then it in effect turns you into two people. One part that's always thinking and one part that only occasionally realizes that you're thinking. So that's Locke's critique. So you can't be two different people in one human being. What's very, very strange is that exactly 200 years later, 1894, the British physician John Ewlings Jackson, whom I will be discussing in a fair amount of detail in this talk, he re-examines the question of the relationship between madness and personhood in an essay called The Factors of Insanities. What's startling, and this is the sort of issue that I want to think about today, is that Jackson proposes in this particular essay that in cases of madness, we authentically witness the emergence of a wholly other person. A genuinely other self, whose otherness and personhood are both epistemologically as well as forensically legitimate. So what was for Locke the absurdity of considering personhood as the effect of pathological deviation becomes for Jackson, in the span of 200 years, an entirely legitimate possibility. So when comparing Locke in 1694 to Jackson in 1894, a certain kind of utterance, a certain kind of way of thinking about something related to the feasibility of calling madness is a genre of personhood. That is, you can be mad and still a person. This kind of utterance, this kind of way of speaking is reiterated, we might say, on a very different kind of style of reasoning. And what results is the near reversal of possibilities, a shift from absurdity to scientific legitimacy. So the question is, how is this possible? Why does this happen? Now, this very obviously, I think, and quite sort of generally, has something to do with the fact that the brain has come to underwrite, we might say, claims about the self, especially for someone like Jackson, who's a neural physiologist, for all intents and purposes. But what I want to suggest is that there's more to this than to say that for Locke, the brain wasn't important for the self, and for Jackson it was. There's something, it's more important to say something beyond this, because this generalization sort of overlooks something very important about the way in which the brain came to ground or anchor claims about the self, such that it could justify this sort of reconceptualization of the very category of what it is to be a person. So what we have to do, or at least what I'd like to try and do for you today, is to consider how the brain has come to articulate something truthful about the self, a certain truth of the self, so that by the end of the 19th century, madness the idea of a kind of mental pathology, became, for some prominent neurologists like John Hughlings Jackson, not a deviation away from the self, but a kind of discrepancy that is internal to the self. So that even in the case of madness, you're not a person, you're simply another person. So what's happened in 200 years that makes this possible? Okay. So the inquiry is not, and this is I think very, very key, as someone who works in the history of neuroscience, it's not to reiterate what we already know, what I think all of us already know and assume, which is that the brain acquires a growing explanatory value for thinking about mind, self, and subjectivity. That's not enough. What we have to do is to consider what it is about the development of brain research that allows something like a neural person or neural personhood to appear as a possible category, a possible way of speaking by the end of the 19th century. And whenever I teach history of neuroscience, I always point out, from around 1630, the brain was never not important, never not the most fundamental organ for thinking about mind and self. And as I'll give you examples for why this is the case. But even in its sort of primacy from the 17th century, no one ever said there was a thing called a neural person until the end of the 19th. So the question is, what exactly is the reason for this? So the question then is, how do we think about this shift from Locke to Jackson, from the 17th century to the 19th century? And what I want to suggest is that this shift isn't necessarily to be explained through the history of neuroscience as such. That is, not necessarily through a history of the mere appearance and importance of the brain, but rather through the history of what I think of as a sort of change in the relationship between physiological normality and pathological disease that underwrites certain transformations about thinking about brain and person. I'll describe this in a fair amount of detail here. So in other words, what might help us understand this transformation, this shift from Locke to Jackson, is not a history of the increasing knowledge and the authority of brain research. So not that, but rather a transformation in the very problem of the relationship between normality and pathology, and one that sort of is interestingly suffused throughout the history of brain research. Okay, so going back to the 17th century, starting with this text. Neuropathology, very important field of study as early as the 17th century. The most prominent text is this one, Thomas Willis's 1681 Essay on the Pathology of the Brain and Nervous Stock. Not a very interesting book, but there it is. Okay. So the question I want to ask right now in the 17th century context is not whether there was such a category as disease in pathology, there certainly was, but rather what pathology meant precisely over and against the category of life, health, and physiological norm. And what I want to do here is ask that question in relationship to this connection between brain and self. So the way I want to start by sort of thinking about this is turning to what I think is probably the most exemplary 17th century discussion of the relationship between selfhood and brain. You might be surprised that it's actually a text by Descartes. We tend to think of Descartes as very much not the person to go to, but actually Descartes' final piece of writing from 1648 is called The Passions of the Soul. And The Passions is very much concerned with how the brain and the nervous system function as the instrument that manages the union of the soul and the body. Now, there's a letter that he writes to Princess Elizabeth in 1643, where he tells us that in the union of the body and the soul, and for Descartes, I can talk about this a bit later on in the Q&A, but for Descartes, it was the soul and the body, it was more important to think of them as in the union rather than as discrete dualistic substances. Well, we can talk about this later. But he points out in this letter that it's in the union that everyone feels themselves to be a single person. And what we see in the Passions is not the famous Cartesian I think, therefore I am, what's typically referred to as the cogito of the Meditations, but something more akin to what we tend to refer to as a kind of Cartesian self. And it was something that Descartes, from as early as the 1620s, had been describing through the kind of framework of a practice, a self-practice, an exercise of the self. And in this text here, The Passions of the Soul, the practice of the self, what he means by that, is explicitly framed as a kind of bodily practice. Sort of what he describes as a kind of cultivation and management of bodily states, given that there's a kind of vulnerability of the soul in relation to the body. So what this text is it's basically a kind of a guidebook, a kind of a self-help, if you like, kind of a therapeutic text. And it sort of specifies as its task not to explain how we can master the passions, our emotions, that is, not how we can abnegate the body, but rather to demonstrate the use that one can make of the malleability, the trainability, if you like, the plasticity of the neuromuscular system, in order, and this is Descartes' goal in this particular text, to rehabituate feelings and emotions to the extent that feelings inhere for Descartes in nervous activity. And they often result in certain automatic actions and behaviors. So Descartes is very explicit in this text that you can change your mood, your behavior, and your will to act or not to act by essentially changing your body or changing your nerves. Now, although this text can be seen as a kind of therapeutics directed toward the treatment of affective irregularities, this passions is not an early instance of the treatment of what we would today call a mental disorder. It has a kind of different function, and it's more related to what in the 17th century was called the regimenting of the mind, learning how to think properly. I can go into that a bit sort of detail later on, but the point I want to make here is that for Descartes, pathology from a mental standpoint didn't even really make any sense. Because from the standpoint of his philosophy, it doesn't make sense to think of the soul as something that can be ill. There's no such thing as a diseased soul. And analogously, a physical disorder could only be understood as a kind of natural error, a breakdown in the otherwise mechanistic lawfulness of life. It's a very different understanding of pathology than what we kind of think of today. So pathology was a kind of an erroneousness, a monstrosity, and it could not effectively coexist with life, but instead it amounted to a sort of total undoing of it. This logic of the extraneousness, the monstrosity of disease or error, also framed the treatment of neuropathology. And we see this most manifestly played out in a very, very dominant way in which the brain was kind of conceptualized, or the way it was kind of figuratively imagined. The metaphor, the dominant metaphor, if you will, that was usually linked to the brain. I'm not going to read this quote here, but it's most explicit in Thomas Willis's writings. And again, Willis was probably the most prominent anatomist of the brain in the 17th century. So particularly for Willis, the brain's anatomy was likened to and imagined through the model of an absolutist state, a sovereign state, a monarchical state of the 17th century, as a kind of castle or a fortress, where the cortical layers, and at this time the cortex was only seen as a kind of functionless crust. The cortical layers, the complexity of the convolutions and the lobes, all of this, generally, as far as they were concerned, performed the work of defending and fortifying the brain's interior. Because it was in the interior, at the brain's center, where we see housed, and therefore essentially safeguarded, the sovereignty of reason, of the mind. The mind is like a king that is in the middle of the castle. And this is actually what justifies Descartes' very, very interesting emphasis on the pineal gland, which, as far as he was concerned, was the place where the soul interacted with the body because it was in the exact middle of the sort of brain castle, as it were. Okay? This is a dominant motif in the 17th century. And what this means is that pathology meant a kind of contamination, the breaching of a castle wall, and therefore the corruption of an entire sovereign order. And the sovereign could either be the king of the state or the king of reason, your mind. And we see this actually, I mean, there's a lot of kind of overlap with a lot of even just political philosophy in the period. So we have Hobbes, so we have Leviathan from 1650, and there's this really lovely chapter where he compares the infirmities of the commonwealth with the diseases of the body. And he says the sovereign is the public soul giving life and motion to the commonwealth, which expiring the members are governed by no more than the carcass of man by the departed soul. So the moment the sovereign is gone, the whole thing collapses. Okay? And just keep in mind, for Hobbes, the soul in man, as opposed to the soul in the state, was tantamount to the animating, organizing capacity of the brain. When we talk about the soul in the human, he essentially means the brain, because he was a materialist. Okay. What this means is that the sort of contaminating breach of pathology would result in a certain undoing of the brain's coherence. if pathology enters the brain, the whole thing collapses. If a disease contaminates, the whole thing is gone. So, I mean, even just to sort of compare this back to Descartes there, pathology was essentially a non-question for Descartes, in the sense that if the brain and the pineal gland were actually infected with disease, even at the sort of most minimal sense, then the very possibility of managing oneself, this idea that links the Cartesian self with the brain, just no longer becomes a possibility. So disease could not co-occur with normal function. This is the idea that I'm trying to get across in the 17th century. We're not going to really see a shift in dominant conceptions of pathology until around the middle of the 18th century. And what's very interesting in the middle of the 18th century is that there's a general turn in all the life sciences to what we consider a kind of vitalist orientation towards thinking about living organisms. And the one place where we see this change in how pathology is being understood is in this very dominant text here, Jerome, oh, this is the Latin here, but Jerome Gao. This is from 1758. It's called Institutions of Medical Pathology. Probably the most prominent pathological textbook to appear in the 18th century. Now, for Gao, health and disease were equivalently naturalized possibilities inherent within the human body. Pathology is not this thing that can be on the outside and potentially breach the wall of the organism or whatever. Pathology is somehow already inside. So disease, and I'm quoting Gao here, he calls it the state of the living human body in which it happens that the functions proper to man cannot be exercised according to the laws of health. So what Gao is suggesting is that pathology was slowly coming to be seen as a possibility already embedded within the otherwise normal organization of the organism, rather than a contamination from outside. So here's this very nice quote here. Mention is made of life in this definition of disease, not only for this reason that disease is an affection of life, nor that it could be conceived without it more than health. It can't be conceived without it more than health. But that it may be understood that there is an active principle in the sick, distinct from the disease itself, to observe and direct the motions of which ought to be the principal care of the physician having a share in the work. Okay? So what he's suggesting here is that the organization of the body, we might say, makes room for disease. It encapsulates it as a possibility. I'm just going to say a couple more things about this, just so you see this sort of shift, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the 19th century stuff, which is a bit more interesting here. But what Gao is suggesting is that health arises as an emerging norm, not because the body is bound to a state of healthy living. The body is not necessarily and automatically always healthy, but because it becomes normal for bodies occasionally to submit to disease. The thing doesn't break down when you have an illness. In fact, the body is thought to be functionally self-organized with disease in mind. So health means, for a lot of the 18th century kind of pathological theorists, health means the ability to self-recover from disease. And the possibility of submitting to an illness becomes a kind of necessity that's built in to what it means to be a living thing. So pathology is no longer a breach that ruins the whole system. Pathology is already something that the organism is able to both submit to and recover from. So this is a subtle kind of transformation that's going on. He writes, in fact, at one point, this is an extraordinary line, he says, the foundation of all medicine is situated in the body itself. So the job of the physician is not to come in from the outside and heal, but to replicate what the body already does naturally to heal itself. Because the body's already prepared for disease. The Cartesian body, the Thomas Willis body, they're not prepared for disease. If they're diseased, they die. Here you're seeing this sort of shift. I don't want to go too long here. I can spend a couple of minutes. I'm going to skip, actually, for the sake of time. There's the neuropathological correlate, and this very, very important mid-century neurophysiologist, Robert White, who's a Scottish physician who was teaching Gao. They were in contact with each other. For the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip through this. But here are some of his. Anyway, when you deal with old, dead white people, the only pretty slides you can have are just the covers of their books. So that's what I have here. here, and I contrast it to other treatises on madness. I can talk about this if you're somehow strangely interested in middle of the 18th century theories of pathology, but I'm just going to skip through this because I want to get to the kind of meat of what I do want to discuss. The kind of historical trend that I'm trying to talk about here, I often describe as a steady normalization of pathology. It's the term I use. And by normalization, I don't mean the standardization of pathological description. What I mean is that it becomes increasingly intelligible and acceptable by physicians to describe organisms in such a way that the possibility of pathological deviation becomes a kind of logic built into the organization of the nervous system. In other words, being normal means the submitting inevitably to a kind of disease and then being able to recover from it. That's what normality means. Normality means preparation for pathology. Okay? So this is the idea that I want to kind of draw your attention to, and an important kind of culminating moment in this history of the normalization of pathology, especially in the study of the brain and nerves, and especially around the question of brain and self, takes place in this historical period that I want to lead to, which is around the 1870s to the 1890s, in the context of British clinical neuropathology. And this is who I was talking about, Jackson, basically Johnny Williams Jackson and his colleagues. Here I want to focus the pathological question on a very specific and quite formative disease for neurologists in this period. This disease is epilepsy. And I say it's a formative disease, in part because, as you'll see, epilepsy is very different at the end of the 19th century than what we imagine it today. You have to sort of be willing to accept that it's just this very different sort of thing. And it's not just an illness in the 19th century, but it's also a kind of problem, because it has these, as I'll explain, a number of epistemological and forensic conundrums attached to it in a way that we don't ever think about it in the context of contemporary neuroscience. And it's precisely these conundrums that were attached to epilepsy that made epilepsy a very seminal kind of problem in refashioning the normative dimensions of the brain at the end of the 19th century, and very integral to what I was describing at the beginning of this talk for why Jackson could say something like, in madness, it's not that your self goes away, it is that another self appears, a legitimately other self. And he means it quite, he's not being figurative. There is another person in the room. Okay. So, just to say some preliminary remarks about epilepsy, it has a very, very long diagnostic history. It goes back to the Greeks. I can't go into too much detail, but it does suffice to point out that the disorder was always defined by the persistent symptom of the submission to uncontrollable motor convulsions. We know these sort of seizures. And from the 17th century, those convulsions always had some kind of relationship with the nerves and the nervous system. That's how they were always sort of described. What that relationship was, it wasn't always very clear. After the end of the 18th century, epilepsy was seen as both very incurable, but also connected to other very incurable disorders like hysteria and hypochondria. And as a consequence, it came to be relegated, especially during the early 19th century in the institutional reforms in psychiatry. It came to be relegated, to an asylum analysis. So epileptics were put in an asylum, and that's how we talk about epilepsy. And that kind of transformation gave to epilepsy the value of being a social disorder. That is, it wasn't just a physiological disorder, it had a kind of social valence to it. And it's partially for this reason that by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, epilepsy was firmly, and when I say firmly, I mean epistemologically, so when you think about what epilepsy is. So epistemologically and diagnostically, epilepsy was linked to criminality. That is, to be an epileptic was somehow also to be a criminal, which is very interesting. The fact that epilepsy was viewed as being intrinsically criminal, this is what I was saying, that there was something deeply, a kind of a conundrum, an epistemological and a forensic conundrum that I'm going to talk about. So here's this very important text from 1874 called Responsibility of Mental Disease. And Henry Maudsley is an important physiologist and was a colleague of Jackson's. And he argues, I'm just going to read this quote here, he says, there is a borderland between crime and insanity, near one boundary of which we meet with something of madness, but more of sin, and near the other boundary of which something of sin and more of madness. Now, this text was meant to be part of a kind of social reform around the jurisprudence of mental disorder, that we have to think about it in new sort of legal terms. But this idea, this sort of widespread belief that madness and criminality share a kind of borderland or a sort of boundary, this was so prominent that you can sort of see what happens when this text of Maudslay's is translated into French. The title, Responsibility and Mental Disease, just becomes Crime and Madness. This belief that they're so kind of attached to each other, they just decided, well, that's the way they were going to translate it. Now, epilepsy in particular had a very stark relationship with criminality, and I'll describe what that means. And it has a lot to do with the fact that an epileptic, or so it was believed, that an epileptic convulsion often resulted in violent, transgressive, and even homicidal fits. It was genuinely thought that an epileptic, after a fit, may commit a murder, just a sort of standard way of thinking. So here's a quote from Maudsley. What happens frequently in silent epileptics is this: after a fit or succession of fits, there follows a brief attack of furious mania, as opposed to just regular mania. On account of its violent and destructive character, it's a most dangerous form of insanity. For the patient, in a frenzy of excitement, unconscious of what he's doing, is driven to the most destructive acts of violence against both animate and inanimate objects. If he's injured or killed someone in his fury, he realizes for the first time, upon regaining consciousness, what he's done. And just a point to make here, it seems kind of ridiculous for us, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. This is not Maudsley's opinion of the criminality of epilepsy is not isolated. So here's a very famous text from 1858. It's a standard textbook on psychological medicine. John Charles Bucknell and Daniel Hacktuch. They describe epileptic episodes as producing a change in the moral character of the person. So it's to be observed that very frequently the presence of epileptic insanity is indicated not by epileptic fits, but simply by the character of the mental disturbance, the paroxysmal gust of passion, the blind fury, without adequate cause. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. But what's so strange is that what these authors are suggesting is that an irrational commission of a crime, that is a kind of act of just furious violence, in many instances that amounts to the epileptic fit itself. So that instead of seizing, you commit a crime. It's very remarkable. And actually, it's not, this is a diagnostic problem. And I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, but I'm going to just show you how it's a pretty standard way of linking criminality and epilepsy. So here's Willem Griesinger's 1845, Mental Pathology and Therapeutics. These are standard textbooks in mental pathology. Still more important, paroxysms of mania immediately following the convulsive attacks of epilepsy. They manifest themselves by such a degree of blind fury and violence, such as wild gesticulation, as scarcely ever occurs in ordinary mania. This sort of nefarious or problematic field of criminal anthropology. So here's this very important text from that field, Moritz Benedict's book, Anatomical Studies Upon Brains of Criminals from 1878. This shocking quote: the constitutional criminal is a burdened individual, has the same relation to crime as his next blood-kin epileptic. So there are blood relations between the criminal as a category and the epileptic. Okay, and one thing I want to just point out is that this, as absurd or whatever from our standpoint as it seems to link intrinsically criminality and epilepsy, is not because these gentlemen were stupid. I mean, they may have been stupid, I don't know. But there was something important and intelligible and necessary in linking epilepsy with criminality. And I'm going to try and draw our attention to what that is. It's very important. So don't just think of it as like, oh, well, in the past they didn't know. No, in the past they knew things very differently than we know them now. And as I said, epilepsy, you have to be willing to admit, meant something very different, even though aspects of it correspond to what we think of as epilepsy today. So we have to be willing to admit that historically it was a different thing. Okay? Just bear with me as far as that willingness to sort of think differently is concerned. Okay. Another important point to draw your attention to is that, especially given that the laws of appraisal of mental disease prevented the sort of nuance sought after by medical professionals, a major transition in the legal definition of madness, one that had taken place in the 1840s, had turned a category previously defined in strictly intellectual terms into a category that was defined in strictly moral terms. And we still have this today. You don't know the difference between right and wrong, so you're crazy. It's like a moral definition of a mental disorder. Very interesting. And that pissed off a lot of psychiatrists and neurophysiologists, because as far as they were concerned, these kind of legal generalizations prevented a necessary legal or jurisprudential discussion of the many inexplicabilities of mental deviation related to criminal acts. Things, as far as they were concerned, were not so general and not so black and white. By the 1860s, the psychiatric positions against lawyers and against the kind of, let's say, legal frameworks of madness, they were coming to be underwritten by a kind of a somatic turn, a neurophysiological turn. They were taking up a lot of claims that were being made by neurologists. Henry Maudsley was one person that the psychiatrists would draw from. So was this other person, Thomas Laycock. Laycock was a very, very important neurophysiologist. He was, in fact, the teacher of John Hillings Jackson, whom I will discuss in a bit more detail. Laycock was such an ardent believer in what in this lecture he called the antagonism between law and medicine over what insanity, properly speaking, what insanity was and who had the right to talk about it and to define it. Anyway, he was such a believer in this antagonism that he advocated in this very peculiar lecture that the physician should join the judge on the bench and hold an adjudicative role in medically related criminal cases. That the judge alone shouldn't be deciding things, that physicians should also be deciding on the law. Now, to just sort of take us back to the question of epilepsy and how this problem of epilepsy plays out in terms of decriminalizing epileptic kind of criminality, the issue was around the problem of responsibility. How do we think about responsibility vis-a-vis the epileptic? What does it mean for an epileptic to not have or to have responsibility for a crime? And epilepsy is very strange, and part of why I like looking at it is because it posed a medical legal problem that you don't really see in a lot of other mental disorders for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, it was the mental disorder that in its symptomatic manifestation tended most towards violent transgression. It was seen as perhaps one of the most dangerous kinds of disorders, and one that was dangerous precisely in its unpredictability. The epileptic would just have an attack and then potentially murder you, as opposed to someone who was just always psychotic, always a murderer, right? You can see how one seems more dangerous because you just never know what's going to happen. As I mentioned earlier, too, and I had that quote from Bucknell and Tuke, they propose that sometimes the violent outburst took the place of the more familiar seizure. So it's not like someone starts seizing and you go, oh, let's get out of here because they're going to kill us. It's just they may just kill you and that's the seizure, right? So there's something very unpredictable about it, and that's what makes it very, very dangerous. And not just dangerous, but also something where thinking about responsibility or no longer being responsible if you're the epileptic was a very sort of tricky thing to discuss. So here's a couple of quotes here. So one's from Maudsley. If the unfortunate sufferer of epilepsy has killed someone under these circumstances, that is after an attack, and has not chanced to come under the observation of a skilled observer, it may go hard with him when he is put on trial for murder. It certainly will. And the reason, as he continues, is that the deed itself has been done with great violence, without indications of premeditation, without apparent motive, and without secrecy. So he gives examples of epileptics who commit a murder and then just fall asleep on the body, which, as far as Maudsley is concerned, no one who intended to murder would ever do something so ridiculous. So obviously this person is suffering from a mental disorder and should not be held responsible for the crime. And then Bucknell and Tuke say, is an ordinary epileptic to be always regarded as criminally irresponsible? If we can't positively say yes, then the fact of, yet still the fact of being subject to fits must, from the strongest presumption, be in his favor. So there is something deeply irresponsible on the part of the epileptic. They can't help it. But so there's this, related to this issue of the kind of unpredictability of the kind of explosive fit of the epileptic attack, is the problem, well, so let me just say this, though, that the issue of responsibility here is about experiential continuity. As an epileptic, you don't have an experience of the crime that you committed. As far as they're concerned, you black out, you commit a crime, you come to, and you can't possibly be kind of held responsible. So there's something unpredictable, there's something unaccountable from the standpoint of the patient. And there's this third issue that's even more kind of remarkable. And it's the fact that epilepsy posed this very kind of shocking diagnostic challenge. And what I mean is that it was generally confirmed in this period that an epileptic attack could often occur imperceptibly. That is, the transition from normal behavior to epileptic mania could not always, in not all instances, be diagnostically marked. You never knew when it was going to happen. I mean, not only do you not know when it was going to happen, you couldn't always tell that it was happening. So a person might quite calmly, in fact, commit a violent act, and without knowing that the violence was preceded by the onset of an epileptic fit, the entire behavior might appear to be quite deliberate. In many cases, nothing signified the transition to an epileptic state, save, retroactively, the commission of violence. And this is what Bucknell and Took meant when they said that the violent act took the place of a seizure. And there was a term that was actually used for this, and the term was masked epilepsy. And this is when motor convulsions that are typical to a seizure are merely replaced with a kind of discrepant behavioral phenomenon. You just act slightly peculiarly. But in a way that nevertheless maintains a kind of low-level social intelligibility. So it's not quite as evident as seizing. It's a little peculiar, but it still seems normal. Like you walk and you open the door and you stab someone. I mean, that's literally what was thought might happen. So again, instead of seizing, a patient might less problematically merely act oddly, or more problematically commit a murder. And this was seen as just a total continuous set of possibilities. In fact, Maudsley describes masked epilepsy, he calls it an epilepsy of mind, kind of mental epilepsy rather than a neurological epilepsy. So this is what takes me to Jackson, whom I already talked about. And Jackson was not directly participating in these medical legal discussions. He didn't really kind of contribute to them, but he was most fascinated by precisely this dimension of epilepsy, that instead of seizing, that instead of a seizure, an epileptic episode could result in just a kind of behavioral discrepancy that formally maintained enough intelligibility at a social level that an untrained observer would not be able to notice the onset of an epileptic episode. So, which means that any one of us could be undergoing an epileptic episode, and no one would really know the difference unless it was a kind of trained observer like Jackson or something like this. So we can already see, and it's not very hard to appreciate, and as Jackson sort of asserts, and I'll give you this quote here, that an analysis of these sort of masked possibilities inherent in epilepsy, although they're not directly important from a kind of medical legal standpoint, they nevertheless have a very important, as he says, indirect medical legal interest. And as far as Jackson was concerned, in the context of the 1870s, and he's writing this he's writing in 1874, the same year of Maudsley's book, epileptic episodes amounted to the reduction of what Jackson called a mental automatism. In other words, a reduction to automatic behaviors that would mimic, with only slight deviations, a gamut of social behaviors that we typically perform automatically or habitually. So the slighter or the more masked the epileptic attack, the more complex the resultant automatism would be. So there's an example he gives that if there's a musician who's fairly automatically playing a well-practiced tune on a piano, that musician were to suffer an epileptic attack, the piano playing would most likely continue uninterrupted and no one would be the wiser. So you can see how dangerous this is, right? As a possibility circulating in the medical world. Any one of us could suddenly just become an epileptic or suddenly have a kind of epileptic episode occurring and we don't even know the difference, right? I'm driving a car and I don't even remember the drive to my office because I do it every single day. Did I have an epileptic episode while I was driving? I can't remember anything, you know? This is the kind of question that's being posed. So this means that, as far as these physiologists were concerned, that the epileptic attack is not only imperceptible, but the resultant behavior that comes after the epileptic attack might also be quite inconspicuous. We're not doing anything like seizing, which is quite conspicuous, but the behavior itself could be quite inconspicuous. And in the commission of a crime, inconspicuousness can often just be seen as deliberation, right? And this is what the physiologists and the physicians thought was the problem with the law and the need to sort of change the law. Because the law would see it as deliberation, whereas in fact, medicine would explain, no, it was an epileptic attack, right? So this is the sort of debate. So insofar as Maudsley and Jackson were imagining it, although epileptic episodes were essentially discontinuous for the patient, that is, you don't remember what happened, you can't explain what happened, the attacks nevertheless maintain a kind of relationship to conscious experience, at least in terms of outwardly replicating certain behavioral norms. So it's discontinuous for you, but for everyone else, nothing seems strange. And just to point out here that there's this very important background psychiatric assumption here, that conscious experience was being viewed more and more as a kind of spectrum category. A lot more leeway was being given to what conscious experience by definition was. There's this quote that Maudsley makes in that book that I've been showing you. He writes, and it's a short quote here, but it's remarkable. He says, "Consciousness is not a constant quantity, but a condition of mind subject to manifold variations, both of degree and kind." So as far as Maudsley was concerned, subjective experience was always pervaded by what he called anomalous states of consciousness. And these include all those mental deviations that were very, very popular at the end of the 19th century, including all the genre of insanities, somnambulism, that is sleepwalking, hypnotic states, mesmeric states, dreams, hallucinations. And just to give you a sense of what's going on kind of historically, this is the time in the North Atlantic where psychiatry and psychology is very interested in the problem of deviated mental states, alternative states of mind. So you have the problem of automatism, William James, William Carpenter. You have the idea of split consciousnesses, multiple consciousnesses in the French psychiatric context. This is 1875. In 20 years, Freud is going to be starting to talk about the dynamic unconscious. I'll mention this and again in just a couple of minutes here, but Jackson was influential on Freud. Freud was reading Jackson in the 1880s. And when you think about the idea of in madness you become another person, so there's a sort of a constellation of ideas that's developing this time here. Okay, this is just sort of a background point to make. Now, Maudsley has this very interesting thing he says about epilepsy, which is that the transitory nature of epilepsy. Because you're not always undergoing an epileptic attack. It's transitory, it's occasional, right? Even though it doesn't even, for an outsider, you can't even tell the difference. But this transitory nature of epilepsy, for Maudsley, was qualitatively similar to a normal phenomenon that we all experience, which is specifically waking up from an extremely vivid and charged dream into a state of confusion, where we're unable for at least a short period of time to distinguish dream from reality. So the anomalous state of consciousness that defines epilepsy for Maudsley was something that we all have or are able to normally experience ourselves. And so like Jackson, Maudsley's also linking epilepsy to the normative structures of behavior and experience, admittedly a sort of expanded domain of what can count as normal behavior and experience. So put otherwise, epilepsy had become continuous with a kind of normality of abnormal states of mind. That it had become normal to think about states of mind in abnormal ways, in part related to the sort of challenge that a disorder like epilepsy had. So with epilepsy, in particular, in the background of the sort of forensic conundrums that framed the conceptualization of it both as a sort of disease as well as a problem. And I say a problem because, again, epilepsy was unpredictable, epilepsy was imperceptible. The animating question for a lot of these physiologists was the question, who? Given these epistemological and forensic kind of conundrums, who do we think we are in any given moment, and who might we suddenly become? This was a truly kind of legitimate problem that they were considering. And there's one sort of final issue here, but I do want to make sure I'm okay on time. What is do we sort of start late or?
We have like another 10 minutes for. 10 minutes? Is that going to be okay?
Yeah, that should be fine. Mm-hmm. I'm going to sort of speed through some of these things here. I'm going to jump to this next quote. Part of Jackson's importance in the history of brain research is this, part of why he's often called the kind of father of modern neurology, is because he introduces an entirely new way of thinking about the relationship between mental states and the brain. Very different from what was very common in the late 19th century, which was a kind of localizationally oriented way of thinking about brain and mental functions. And what Jackson did is and I'll read this quote in a second here, so you can look at it, but I'll explain kind of what this is. Jackson is sort of developing what we now come to describe as an evolutionary structure of the nervous system, a kind of vertical, hierarchical, layered understanding of the nervous system that was predicated on organizational complexity. There's a lot that can be said about this, but part of where Jackson is developing this new structure of thinking about that, and this is one that we still have, I mean, I think this is still somewhat dominant. Part of where he was getting this was from his own clinical research. He was a clinician, he was not an experimentalist, and his primary clinical cases were epileptics. So he was dealing with epileptics in a neurological hospital. Epilepsy was a neurological disease. And drawing from his clinical kind of work on epileptics, he developed or devised this entirely new way of thinking about the nervous system, which is, again, this kind of hierarchical structure. And I'll read the quote, but the way it works is that the more complex you get in terms of the structure of the nervous system, the more activities get represented in higher and more complex ways. So the lowest levels of the nervous system, the most peripheral levels, you have representations of certain parts of the body. These parts of the body get, in a sense, as he describes, represented and then re-represented in more complex forms. So we talk about today, and this is sort of the Damasio idea of the brain mapping all the parts of the body. This is Jackson. This is what Jackson's talking about. This is where it's sort of originating in this moment. And not mapping specific topographical parts of the body, but mapping certain what we call functional parts of the body. So the brain maps the functions of the body, not the parts of the body. So this is something, I won't go into the details of it, it'll take a bit too long, but this is something that Jackson is deriving from his clinical research on epileptic patients. So epilepsy, in a certain way, was functioning as a kind of blueprint that helped Jackson develop this totally novel approach to the brain. I'll read this quote here. So, speaking very roughly indeed, we may say that from a separate, detailed representation of parts of the body by the lowest centers up to the highest cerebral centers, there's a gradual mixing up by stages of increasingly complex representation. So at the acme of representation, each unit of the highest centers represents or re-represents, and other places he says re-represents the whole organism in most complex ways. So you have a kind of, I don't think Damasio even knows about this, it doesn't matter, but anyway, this is what Jackson is developing. He's developing it right out of epilepsy. And so the point here is that epilepsy is not only being understood in the context of the 1870s as a normalized abnormality from the standpoint of the neural physiology, because as far as Jackson is concerned, epileptic convulsions are a kind of breakdown of these functional structures. You have to understand them from his standpoint, these sort of functional structures. So epileptic attacks are not
there you go. Sometimes the building manager doesn't listen to us.
That's fine. Well, hopefully this is not going to turn on?
There's that screen right next to you. Just press system on again.
It's waiting. All right, so epileptic attacks were not understood as an aberration to something that's normal to you, but just a kind of exacerbation of normal movements working their way up and down this kind of hierarchical structure. So when things go just slightly, when things are, let's say, exacerbated, or perturb somewhat excessively, that's just an excess of what is a normal motor movement. As far as Jackson is concerned, this is explained by the fact that we have to reimagine the motoric possibilities of humans in this kind of evolutionary structure. To explain exactly why that is would take a lot more time than I have, but just that's how he was thinking about it. So the projector is shutting down. All functions are unavailable until this operation is complete, which will take a minute. But anyway, I'll just talk at you. So epilepsy is functioning for Jackson as a way of reimagining what is normal to the neurophysiology of movement and sensory motion, or excuse me, the sort of sensory motor possibilities of the physiological system of the nerves. Epilepsy is also being understood as this weird normal abnormality from the standpoint of mental experiences. So it has this function for a lot of these physiologists where people are reimagining what the norm is through this very peculiar pathology of epilepsy and giving the norm, let's say, a certain kind of expanded sense. So that, as I described, we're sort of normally abnormal or abnormally normal, if you like. And so from the standpoint, it's almost like you can say that, somewhat figuratively, we are all fundamentally epileptics, but some of us are just more epileptic than
It's right
others.
behind you. You can stop it.
So system on.
Yes.
I just have 5 more minutes. To say that we're all epileptics, and I mentioned Jackson's influence on Freud. Freud has this line in 1895 in his text called The Project for Scientific Psychology. I will need I have a couple of pictures to show.
Yeah. Is the system turning
The
on?
system is on.
Okay.
Computer display or main menu or what?
Computer display.
40 more seconds. Okay, it's fine. It's fine. So Freud makes this line in 1885 in The Project for Scientific Psychology, where he also says, and I'm quoting him, he says, every adolescent must carry the germ of hysteria within him. We are all, for Freud, always already hysterical. Sometimes it manifests, sometimes it doesn't. In a very similar way, we're also always epileptic in a certain respect as well. Okay, so this is this very bizarre phenomenon happening in the 19th century. Okay. So epilepsy is becoming something more than just an illness, but a kind of a problem, a conceptual problem, something that is animating how people are thinking about selfhood in relation to brain, selfhood in terms of the intelligibility of behavior. It has this very, very peculiar kind of function. Now, what's very interesting is that Jackson also uses this model to redefine what pathology means. And it's very simple, actually. Pathology means, instead of the nervous system evolving upwards, it dissolves downwards. So it's a kind of regression to a lower level. So what's very interesting is that in instances of pathology, as far as Jackson is concerned, what we see as in terms of like a mental disorder, as an abnormal state of mind, it's not the fact that, let's say, a very high center is debilitated. But what happens in states of pathology is that a high center is debilitated, and then the center that's just below it is now exposed. It's disinhibited. It is now manifest. So what we're seeing is now a new, let's say, a new brain. It used to be this brain, but this brain somehow, for example, an epileptic attack or a traumatic injury goes away, either permanently or temporarily. So now the lower level, that's exposed, that pops up, and what we see as a pathological behavioral state is this lower level acting, just sort of acting out. In the 1870s, the lower level acting out, Jackson called mental automatism. But in the 1890s, in that essay I showed you, The Factors of Insanities, so here's an example. You see A is knocked out, and you have B, C, D. Each layer is kind of knocked out here. In the 1870s, in states of pathology, that was mental automatism. But by the 1890s, what he says is, when a top layer is knocked out and something new is exposed, what you have is a new person, a totally new person. So I'm going to end with this. And I'm being a bit fast here, but you'll get the gist of what I'm saying. It's this really extraordinary line, and I think it needs to sort of be read. In a dissolution state, a pathological state, and again, you saw those layers, A, B, C, D. So, and he's being very figurative. He's just saying, let's assume a layer of function gets knocked out. So you have negative A, B, C, D. He says the whole person is now just B, C, D, the lower levels of the brain. The term negative A is only given to indicate how the new person, the man insane, B, C, D, differs from the former person, the sane man, A, B, C, D. Suppose the same man is X, so the insane man, the new person, Y is X minus A, that is Y is B, C, D. This is not too important, but here is really sort of quite fascinating. When using the term new person for Y, we must urge that what we call his delusions are his beliefs. And most generally, his positive mental symptoms are samples of mentation which is only abnormal in contrast with the mentation of the prior self X. There's nothing inherently pathological about the new person, unless you're going to just compare that new person with the old person. And we only say that the new person is merely different from the old person. He goes very, very far in what you can consider kind of casuistic approach. That in cases of pathology, it's not bad. As far as he's concerned, it's a new norm. A new person, a new norm, a new brain. This is all just now appeared. It can be temporary in an epileptic attack. A new person, a new norm, and a new brain arises, and you commit a murder. And then that person goes away because the layer A comes back. But in cases of trauma, it doesn't come back. And you're only now this other person. Right? So it's this very extraordinary kind of way of thinking. And I'm just trying to think of, I'm going to wrap up very quickly, and I just want to make sure I hit all the points. So I think what's going on here, and I think what we can say is that the notion of the person by the 1890s manifestly arises as a category that is indissociable from the brain. Because, and there's this quote here, at every instance of breakdown, you get subsequently new persons, until basically all the highest centers are gone, in which case it says there's no person but only a living creature. So as far as Jackson is concerned, there is no moment in pathology where there isn't a connection between personhood and brain. There's always some person at some level of brain. And part of this has to do with the fact, I think, that thinking about pathologies as a norm has become so acceptable and such a central way of thinking that each case of pathology is not a deviation, it's the introduction of a new norm. It's an introduction of a different state of normality. So in pathology, you're not no longer a self, you're a differently normal self. We could say a sort of differently normaled self. Right? So it's, again, pathological only from that kind of casuistic sense of comparing it to a kind of former person. So part of this, and I'm just going to wrap up here, part of this, I think, transformation between why Locke says you can't be another person in madness and why with Jackson you can be, has something to do with how central and how normalized pathological deviations become. So normal that it's just totally standard. It's not a pathology really, it's a new normality. Right? So this is the idea that I think is sort of emerging. So we don't ask the question, why was there no such thing as a neural person in the 17th century? I don't think there really was such a thing. But I think the more important question to ask in the 17th century is, why was the expression of the self, much like Descartes does it, only implicitly tied to the nervous system, and always in a way that excluded the possibility of pathology? Remember, for Descartes, there's no pathology. You can't reach the walls. By the time we get to Jackson, the question is not to say, why is there a neural person? That's not, I don't think that's going to be a question that can actually get us any answers. I think the question is, how does the problem of the normality and inevitability of pathology the centrality of pathology. Pathology is all around you. It's as normal as waking up from sleep. That's as normal as experiencing an epileptic attack. It's so normal that we are required to ask of ourselves, who are we now and who might we at any moment become? So it's this being forced to think in these terms, I think, that led someone like Jackson to say, there is never not person not connected to brain. There's brain and person are always and intrinsically linked. So in some ways, it's not that we are our brains. It is that we are pathologically, first and foremost, our brains. Okay, so I'll stop there. I covered a lot of ground very fast, and I'll take some questions now. I just want to make sure that it's all very clear, but I'll just stop here. So, good.
So yeah, feel free. We'll just have you pick out people from the crowd. I don't need to mediate it. But yeah.
So yeah, and again, just the main point here is what pathology has meant. That it has become so central, so normal to think about pathology, that it becomes scary, right? It becomes like any one of us can be an epileptic. Indeed, all of us are in some ways epileptic. And as a consequence, you can't say epilepsy is no longer being a person, it's becoming another person. So we're all possibly different persons all the time, but always neural persons all the time. So this is an idea that I want to try and make sure you have the gist of what I'm saying. But I'll take questions, especially clarifying ones. Yeah?
The whole layer arranging that you were talking about at the very end, was there any room for that theory for like layers to be added? It kind of seemed like you could knock down layers and eventually you would lose.
So there were sort of layers within layers. As far as he was concerned, there were three general groupings. The first was the peripheral nervous system, the cerebral spinal axis, and the highest cortical center. So one gets kind of mapped into the other. And that's an evolution. But within each one, as far as he was concerned, there were also sublayerings, no doubt. As far as he was concerned, it's from a psychological standpoint, we don't need to worry about the sublayerings at the peripheral nervous levels. It's at the cortical levels that we need to worry about. He never went into a lot of detail about how many layers there were at the highest levels. He was just using this as a diagram. Let's just say there's 4, so I can make it easy for everyone. He was, I think, interested in thinking about it. I don't remember him ever talking about, I know what you're saying, like a kind of a neurogenerative kind of layering. Like would learning produce new layers? It's a good question. You'd think that it could be possible. And I think that you can say it was, because what he always says is that the nervous system is always in a state of evolution. It's always being represented, re-represented higher and higher and higher. That is learning, right? That's learning and development. So I think from a certain standpoint, from a functional standpoint, you could say layers are always being added. How this would translate into neuroanatomy, I don't think he didn't, he wasn't like doing like detailed experimental work or anything like that. But that's a great question. Yeah.
I'm curious as to whether there are records of epileptic patients actually being murderers. I mean, where
so yeah, they all give examples. So they all give case studies. Yeah, and I didn't give any examples of case studies, but there are numerous case studies. Of course, whether they're epileptics from a contemporary neurophysiological standpoint is unclear. It's someone, so for example, someone who just kind of spaces out and then starts trying to strangle someone. That was considered an epileptic attack, right? So they wouldn't clinically describe instances of seizures because they were, from their standpoint, not very interesting, right? You would need to be written about if all you did was seize. So if we could have a time machine and actually take some contemporary diagnostic measures back, I think most of the cases called epileptic were not epileptic. But in some ways it also didn't matter because clearly someone who just decides for no apparent reason to just turn around and start strangling someone, there is some pathology at work, right? And so what they were trying to do was understand it from all these different trajectories, neurophysiological, epistemological, and legal.
So it's just anything where there's this discontinuity?
Absolutely. And you're exactly right, a kind of discontinuity for the person, and a way in which something only seems slightly odd, right? As opposed, and the person can't account for it. So that's actually you're hitting the thing I think is most interesting. So I don't really, it's like I kind of don't care about the epilepsy as such. My interest is in this disorder defined by this discontinuity, because it was a problem, right? When I say problem, I mean not just a biomedical problem, but it was a legal problem, a philosophical problem. Like, who are we when suddenly we can just turn around and just murder our children, and then for no reason? I mean, maybe they had a reason, but it's a bit macabre. But anyway, or do other strange things. So he, one of Jackson, there's an article where he says his favorite case is not the crazy, like the ones where there's murder. It's this one case where the guy decided to document his epilepsy. So he has this set of, he's like at a dinner, and he's like writing a diary, and nothing strange happens to him. He has dinner, doesn't remember what happened, goes home, is with his family, decides to go get some food, and ends up, I think, cooking something like paint in the cat bowl, or something, like instead of soup in the cooking bowl. And that's it, right? That's the event. For Jackson, what he likes about it is that it replicates something normal, but there are these slight deviations. So for him, that was more fascinating than something so controversial like a murder. It's like, if it's a murder, we're all immediately repulsed. Oh, you murdered. All these, by the way, these clinical cases, they tend to be about people murdering their children. Like, there's just this overabundance of the murder of children in a lot of these episodes. It's so controversial, so cited, we can't help but have an opinion. It's in these weirder cases that we can actually have a kind of more clinical nuance. So you're exactly hitting on what epilepsy was as a problem. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, why don't we take one more? And
Yeah.
then, of course, you'll be free to answer questions
Of course, yeah.
over dinner.
Monday.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay. If there are any